Alright, so today I'm going to be presenting on this article, Physical Activity as a Moderator of the Association Between Anxiety Sensitivity and Binge Eating. So binge eating is an abnormal eating pattern that displays itself as the consumption of an excessive amount of food in a short period of time, and it is also accompanied by a lack of control while eating. And it is an eating disorder that is separate than bulimia and anorexia, even though it is itself a symptom of bulimia. And as you can see from this diagram, it's one of the most prevalent eating disorders that occurs throughout the lifetime for both men and women. Its frequency is about double the rate of both bulimia and anorexia for both genders. And while binge eating obviously has ramifications for our health and physical and social functioning, it also has implications for our psychological health. And this includes our self-esteem and also increased levels of negative affect. And negative affect is the experience of negative emotions and a lower self-concept. Some theories that explain why people engage in these maladaptive behaviors involve reinforcement theory, and in particular, binge eating has been proposed to be an intrapersonal negative reinforcement. And this just means that the behavior is maintained through a reduction of negative affect or personal distress. And this is because it has been shown that people who engage in this disinhibited eating pattern believe that eating will lower their negative affect and make them feel better in a way. And so one variable that has been linked to eating disorders such as bulimia in the past is anxiety sensitivity, and this is just a fear of anxiety, and it also manifests in an increased level of negative affect. And it plays a role in the development, maintenance, and exacerbation of current and pre-existing anxiety problems, and it also has been associated with depression and substance use problems. And these substance use problems have been shown to not be specific to one type of substance. So it has been linked to smoking problems, alcohol use, and marijuana use. And so the hypothesis is that these substance use problems could extend to substances such as food. And these substances serve as a coping motive for people as a way to decrease the level of negative affect they experience because of their high anxiety sensitivity levels. And also in recent literature, physical activity has been linked to this relationship between binge eating and anxiety sensitivity, partially because of the cross-stressor adaptation hypothesis, which is just that the adaptations that we gain through physical activity, such as physiological adaptations and neuroendocrine adaptations, can transfer to non-physical activity stressors, such as psychological stressors, so negative affect and other experiences related to anxiety sensitivity. So the current study was investigating whether or not the protective factors of physical activity may extend from negative affect to binge eating, since physical activity may serve as a kind of buffer against the stress that is experienced for negative affect. And so this study involved two main hypotheses, really, which consisted of a moderator and a mediational relationship. And so the first hypothesis was that physical activity would moderate the association between anxiety sensitivity and binge eating frequency. And specifically, they hypothesized that this association would be weaker among participants who are more physically active, because people who are more physically active may experience a reduction in the negative affect, and so they wouldn't feel the need to binge eat as often or at all. And so the top part of this diagram over here kind of corresponds with the first hypothesis in illustrating that. And the second hypothesis involves a mediational relationship, particularly between anxiety sensitivity and binge eating frequency. And they hypothesized that the coping motives would mediate this relationship, and in addition, physical activity would moderate this relationship. And so they hypothesized that this mediational analysis would only be significant for those who are not very physically active. And as you can see, the lower part of the diagram illustrates this hypothesis really well. And as you can see, there's kind of a lot going on. There's 4 different pathways that they consider, But also to be noted is that in addition to the frequency of physical activity, they took into account the intensity of physical activity that was being done by participants. And so they differentiated between moderate physical activity and vigorous physical activity as far as intensity. I don't believe they made specific hypotheses regarding the intensity, but they definitely chose to include this factor into their experiment. And so the design of this study was purely based on surveys. And so they collected data through an internet-based survey of alumni from a private U.S. university. And so they ended up with a sample of about 167 people, ranging from the ages of 31 to 81 years old. And they used a variety of measures, as you can see. There was about 6. And so they used the Eating Disorder Diagnostic Scale to gauge binge eating frequency, the eating expectancies inventory was a way to measure coping motives, so the extent to which people believe that eating will reduce negative affect. They used the Anxiety Sensitivity Index, which is pretty self-explanatory. The International Physical Activity Questionnaire, which measured the frequency of people's physical activity within the last week, as well as the intensity of this exercise. And they also measured the positive affect and negative affect through this scale, as well as BMI, since this has been correlated to eating disorders. So for the analyses, since all of this work was survey and correlational, they utilized a multiple regression, and so they tested a total of 3 statistical models, which I didn't put on this slide just because I figured it wasn't very helpful visually, and so instead I just included the diagram that I included on the hypotheses page. And so they tested a total of 3 statistical models, as I said, which correspond to the 4 different pathways. So they had a model for the C pathway, a model for the A pathway, and a model for the B and C prime pathways. And so for their first hypothesis, they did find an association between binge eating and anxiety sensitivity, and it did vary by physical activity frequency. However, they did find some unexpected results, which I'll go over in the next slide. And these results were differentiable between moderate physical activity and vigorous physical activity. And for their second hypothesis, they actually did not find that physical activity acted as a moderator of this mediational relationship. However, when they took out the physical activity factors, they did find that there was a mediational relationship. So basically, they found that anxiety sensitivity did predict coping motives, and coping motives predicted binge eating frequency. So this diagram illustrates the results of the first hypotheses, and as you can see, they split the graphs into vigorous physical activity and moderate physical activity. And I starred the associations that were found to be significant. So for the bottom graph, the people who did not engage in moderate physical activity showed an association with the anxiety sensitivity and binge eating frequency, and that just was in line with their original hypothesis that the physical activity would not protect people against the binge eating if they were high in anxiety sensitivity. And then for the top graph, there was an association in the opposite direction. So people who displayed high frequencies of vigorous physical activity showed a strong relationship with the association between anxiety sensitivity and binge eating frequency. So this suggests that the vigorous physical activity actually worked in the opposite direction, and that it might be harmful to this association. It might potentiate the association between anxiety sensitivity and binge eating frequency. So there are several implications for this study, theoretical and clinical. And so first of all, overall, this research supports previous studies about anxiety sensitivity and conditions characterized by binge eating disorder. And as I mentioned before, there had been found a link between anxiety sensitivity and bulimia, but there hadn't been studies specifically on the act of binge eating and binge eating disorder itself. And then also, since neither the vigorous physical activity or the moderate physical activity seem to influence the mediational effect of coping motives, they are thinking that maybe physical activity influences this association due to other reasons than the coping motives for eating. And then lastly, since the vigorous physical activity produced an opposite result of their original hypotheses regarding its effect on the risk of binge eating, they are thinking that it may potentiate the negative influence of anxiety sensitivity on binge eating. It also has some limitations, as studies tend to. This includes that their sample size was predominantly Caucasian. I think it was around 90% were Caucasian. So this clearly limits the generalizability. Also, for the self-report assessment of physical activity, it only measured the past week of physical activity. So while this, in a way, maintains the accuracy of people's memories regarding the physical activity, since it was a self-report measure and not like a daily activity log, it does limit the scope of people's physical activity regimens, whereas if we had recorded, say, a month or a longer period of time, that would have perhaps captured the entirety of people's physical activity. And then lastly, since this was correlational work using causal modeling, we can't rule out possible third variable explanations such as physiological differences, genetic vulnerability, etc. And then for the future, there are different directions we can go as far as research as well as treatment within a clinical setting, and this involves an assessment and treatment of anxiety sensitivity and maladaptive beliefs about food. So this just means educating people about the ways in which food really isn't a good way to use as a coping motive for anxiety sensitivity or negative affect. And instead, we might want to implement a moderate intensity physical activity program to see if this would help people reduce these negative affect experiences. And also for research in this area, we might want to manipulate physical activity and other measurements such as perceived health in an attempt to kind of examine certain hypotheses a little closer regarding this type of research. Thank you.